Good evening and welcome to this virtual program from the American Antiquarian Society entitled Phillis Wheatley Peters and African Lineage and Kinship in the Age of Phillis, featuring Honorée Fanonne Jeffers. I'm Jim Moran, Vice President for Programs and Outreach here at the Society, and I'm joined in this webinar by my colleague, Kayla Hopper, the Society's Director of Outreach, who will assist in the running of this program. At this point, I would like to ask Kayla to describe some details about how we are conducting the program. Kayla?
Good evening, everyone. Glad to have you with us tonight. I just want to share a few notes about how we'll be using the Zoom webinar functions. For the Q&A portion of the program, after the formal talk, we'll be using the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. The Q&A function can be found at the bottom of your screen. By using the Q&A function, we'll better be able to keep track of questions. And it also has an upvote function. So if someone posts a question that you really want to see get asked during the Q&A, just be sure to upvote it to help get it to the top of the queue. You can place your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program. Due to the large number of attendees, the chat box will only be used for informational purposes. And throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information there. And you can also contact us as presenters if there's any technical problems or something we should know about. You can also still contact us. If you want to save the chat to retain the links for future use, you can save the transcription by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. We're also pleased to be collaborating with Tidepool Bookshop, a local independent bookstore in Worcester, Massachusetts, to sell copies of The Age of Phillis at a 10% discount, which is good through tomorrow, November 6th. I'll be placing a link to order the book through Tidepool in the chat momentarily, and I'll also include instructions about how to get the discount when you order through that link. And finally, just a note that we are recording the program and we'll make it available on our website and our YouTube channel for viewing later. And that's it for me. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Kayla. The American Antiquarian Society is a learned society and national research library dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing the myriad stories of the American past. As a learned society, we are a place both physical and virtual, where all kinds of people from diverse backgrounds and experiences can come together to explore the American past before the 20th century. Our library, located in Worcester, Massachusetts, holds all manner of printed primary source materials: books, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, music, graphic images, and ephemera, as well as a substantial collection of manuscripts and secondary source materials. Our collections of American imprints, created before the year 1820, is the largest in the world. The AS campus, including our main building, our main library building, and several historic structures that house our staff and visiting fellows, is all located on ancestral lands of the Nipmuc people. We are proud to be collaborating with this community, which still thrives today in some of our programming. Each year, the American Antiquarian Society encourages research in our collections by offering about 50 fellowships that bring researchers to Worcester for periods of 1 month to 1 year. In 1995, we began a new type of fellowship, opening our collections to writers and artists of all types. To celebrate the 25th anniversary of this program, we have created a website showcasing the artists who have come to work in the AS collections. Kayla will share a link to this website in the chat function. I would also like to acknowledge Carolyn Stoffel and Amanda Kondak, 2 AS colleagues who created this great website. Our speaker this evening is one of those artists. She held a Robert and Charlotte Barron Creative and Performing Artist and Writers Fellowship in 2009. Honorée Fanonne Jeffers is a poet, writer, and essayist. She is the author of 5 books of poetry. Her most recent work, The Age of Phillis, is the subject of this program and was published earlier this year by Wesleyan University Press. It is a book of poems based upon the life and times of Phillis Wheatley Peters, America's first African-American poet. The Age of Phillis was long listed for the 2020 National Book Award in Poetry. Jeffers has also received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Witter Bynner Foundation through the Library of Congress, among others. She has received 2 Lifetime Achievement notations, including induction into the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame. Honorée was also elected a member of the American Antiquarian Society in 2014. Currently, she is professor of English at the University of Oklahoma. Now I'll ask Honorée to unmute herself and to put on her camera, and take it away, Honorée.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? All right. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate the support, and I'm so grateful to the American Antiquarian Society, a place where I've had so much joy over the years, especially that magical summer of 2009 when I was a Robert and Charlotte Barron Fellow, conducting research on the life and times of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. Special thanks to Jim Moran and Kayla Hopper of the Society for inviting me to give this talk on Phyllis Wheatley Peters and African lineage and kinship. I'd like to give a special thank you to Ms. Caroline Sloat, my mentor during that summer of 2009. I'm so grateful for her patience and her kindness and her strong faith in my ability to write this book. Before I continue to the core of my talk, I'd like to say that when I point out what I believe to be gaps in the scholarship and the writing about Phyllis Wheatley Peters, I do so in service of her legacy and not to diminish the profound, important work of other scholars. I want to make that clear because sometimes when one person gets a lot of attention for their work, it may give the appearance that this person has ignored the worthy, excellent work others have performed previously. That is certainly not my intention. All of us who do research and writing on Phyllis Wheatley Peters are her devotees, and I am so grateful for and respectful of the careful historical excavation performed by scholars who have come before me. I am a scholar now, but at this point, still an apprentice. It is not a coincidence that my latest book of poetry, The Age of Phillis, is a hybrid of poetry, scholarship, and nonfiction. I, too, am a hybrid. A proud African-American reared in Black communities, but also someone of Indigenous background. A poet, essayist, fiction writer, and novelist who embarked on a heart-rending journey to write a book based upon the life and times of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, the mother of African-American literature. This will be a hybrid presentation, combining poetry, personal recollection, and research. And so, I begin with the poem imagining the earliest years of the one I call Gune, which means very little child in the Wolof language of West Africa. The year is around 1756, and we are in a village in the Gambia, a country where the British have established James Island, a slave trading fortress some distance away from the village where Gune lives with her parents. She is a precocious toddler, about 2.5 to 3 years old. She is walking with Yai, a word which means mother in Wolof, and they are picking fruit for Bai, Gune's father. I imagined that day for this poem called Dafa Rafet, which means it is or this is beautiful in Wolof. This poem is dedicated to Charlie Erickson. When mother and child walk from the village to gather fruit, faces recite quotidian love. Do you have peace? Wow, wow, jam rek. Then they are alone, and the toddler points out the fat-bottomed baobab, the mango with its frustrating reach. Mother pierces a low-hanging jewel, and her small shadow trills gratitude. Yai, you are so nice. Wow, wow. Yai, I love you so. Wow, wow. No demonstration, but a hand touching the tender head that was braided over cries. Later that night, the father must listen too. Bye, I ate a mango. Wow, wow. Bye, I saw a bug. Wow, wow. The child sits closer to his mat, whispers ambiguous lights. I know all the things. And he does not answer, but smiles at his wife. Their daughter is a marvel, and they must pray for humility. Why did I begin my book in Africa? Why didn't I start on this side of the water as an impatient reader of an earlier draft of the book admonished me to do? They told me I was taking too long to get to the important portions of the story of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. Before I discuss my observations on the existing research, I'll offer a condensed version of an anecdote that I've told many times on how I began this journey in Africa. That while I was a fellow at the American Antiquarian Society, another fellow, a young white graduate student at Cornell, asked me when I was traveling to Africa to conduct research on the early life of Wheatley Peters, whom I thought of as Phyllis Wheatley at the time. His name was Jonathan Sinchen, and I told him I had no intention of going to Africa. At that time, I was still upset about enthusiastic African participation in the transatlantic slave trade. But then Jonathan shamed me, asking, "You're going to start Phyllis Wheatley's story with slavery?" I know he didn't mean to make me feel bad, for as my mother likes to say about someone unaware of their transgression, he meant well. Yet in all this time, I've never told an equally monumental story, and I'm not sure why. That after that same talk in summer 2009, a Black woman fellow chided me about lavishing so much praise on the white Bostonians who had purchased a little African girl. That fellow was Tanya Mears, and she made her position clear. You called the Wheatleys surrogate parents, she said. They weren't her parents. They were her masters. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't linger on Tanya's words, not then. But nearly 3 years after my fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society, I did take Jonathan Sinchen's advice. I traveled to Senegal. I spent a whirlwind 10 days there visiting Gorée Island, St. Louis, and the Petite-Côte. I met a Senegalese man who was Muslim. 7 years later, we married in London, where I had traveled to retrace the steps of Wheatley Peters while she was still enslaved and unmarried. I stayed a month in London, living in an apartment in the SE5 district with my husband, 2 other Senegalese, an Ivorian, as well as a little boy. Everyone except me was Muslim. The little boy was around 3, going on 4. He had a British accent and he was very grumpy and immune to my considerable charm. But he was a brilliant child who spoke 4 languages fluently and seamlessly. He would move back and forth between English and French or French and Wolof quickly during the same conversation. He had a large vocabulary he could draw upon, stringing together complete sentences, and he had a precocious sense of humor, sometimes lacing his conversation with sarcasm. And throughout that month in London, I thought about another child, one who would be renamed Phyllis Wheatley, and how her slave master, John Wheatley, had described her early accomplishments. Quote, Phyllis was brought from Africa to America in the year 1761, between 7 and 8 years of age. Without any assistance from school education and by only what she was taught in the family, she, in 16 months' time from her arrival, attained the English language, to which she was an utter stranger before, to such a degree as to read the most difficult parts of the sacred writings, to the great astonishment of all who heard her. Unquote. Back in the United States, I became friends with Bala Saho, a colleague of mine in the history department at the University of Oklahoma. Bala and his wife were from the Gambia. They were Mandinka, but spoke fluent Wolof as well, and fluent English too. They were very kind and welcomed my then husband and me into their home. Although these interactions took place 2.5 centuries after the death of Phillis Wheatley Peters, still I was able to observe cultural, familial, and religious dynamics. And I began to understand the significance of what I had previously ignored about the life of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. I'm going to read another poem. This is First Time Prayer. Yai and Gune, someplace in the Gambia, circa 1759. The water was preparation. When the mother and her child rose in the morning, no Jesus, the same God, yet with 99 monikers. We have awoken, and all of creation has awoken, for Allah, Lord of all the worlds. The bowl, wooden or gourd, was light, as water and faith are heavy. In the century after this mother and child are dead, someone will write about these mornings that the mother poured a ritual for her daughter to remember. This writing, someone won't know of ablutions, of giving peace, of purity required before submission, that God's servants had ached all night to be clean. As I've mentioned in my afterword of the Age of Phillis, most of what we thought we knew about the life of Phyllis Wheatley Peters comes from two texts, Memoir and Poems of Phyllis Wheatley, a Native African and a Slave, dedicated to the Friends of the Africans, which has been attributed, without proof, to Margaretta Matilda Odell, and Memoir and Poems of Phyllis Wheatley, a Native African and a Slave, by Benjamin Bussey Thatcher, whose name does appear on the title page. Both books were published 50 years after the death of Wheatley Peters. Thanks to the fine research of Kara Glott in her essay recently published in early January 2020 in Early American Literature, to perpetuate her name, Appropriation in Autobiography, and Margaretta Matilda Odell's Memoir of Phyllis Wheatley, we now finally have a detailed documented genealogy of Odell, one which links her as kin to Susanna Wheatley, the former mistress of Wheatley Peters. However, besides a vague footnote in the proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society, we still have no documented provenance for the Odell memoir. And so, until that provenance is located, we cannot say for sure that Margaretta Matilda Odell is the author of one of both of these texts. So you will see me every time I say Odell memoir. I will continue to do that. And I'm sure that's very annoying, and hopefully it's annoying enough for someone to find an actual provenance and proof that she wrote this work. Instead of Glatt's essay solving the mystery of the two memoirs, one by Thatcher and one by Odell, that mystery is further complicated. Because of Glatt's research, we now have a definitive link between Thatcher and Odell. In her will, she left Thatcher's mother a financial legacy, which further begs the question that I asked in my afterword: just what was the relationship between Odell and Thatcher? A deeper exploration of that relationship is for another time. My purposes here are not to speculate about which author of which memoir plagiarized from whom. It's obvious there was plagiarism. Rather, it's important that I identify the ancestral and kinship erasures in the Odell biography as it relates to Wheatley Peters. And I use the term biography advisedly, for this work involves a white writer making incredibly speculative leaps about the emotional interiority of a Black woman, as well as grossly false charges about that woman's husband. Thus, I will continue to insist this text should be termed historical fiction. Though memoir is presented as contributing to the goals of the Africans, there is no space that Blackness or Africanness occupies without the guiding influence of whiteness. Thus, the Odell memoir is a biography of supposedly extraordinary whiteness and how it supplants Blackness. I'm not the only scholar to point out the evident racism toward John Peters in the Odell memoir. Vincent Coretta has discussed the problematic characterization in Phyllis Wheatley biography of Genius and Bondage, and Kara Glatt discussed it in her essay. The latter scholar argues that Odell is not necessarily a racist, but rather a feminist who shuttles John Peters to the side in order to embrace female solidarity. Quote, reading Odell's account of Wheatley, published 13 years before her commitment to a mental institution, that is not in the quote, but that's what happened, I will argue reveals a text preoccupied by bonds of female affection that provide an alternative to conventional family ties. Her account itself relying on an exclusive female line of transmission, Odell foregrounds an idealized portrait of the young Phyllis's relationship with her mistress cum mother, Susanna, unquote. Admirable research aside, for Glatt's research is utterly commendable. The problem here with Glatt's argument is that aside from Phyllis Wheatley Peters, there are no other Black women in the Odell memoir who occupy an important space. No girlfriends, no mentors, and of course, no mother. Further, there is only one sentence in this essay that even mentions intersectionality. And that one sense indicates that considerations of intersectionality are absent. Instead, Glatt relies on a false construct of universal womanhood and sisterhood, casting Odell as sympathetically as Odell cast Susanna Wheatley in memoir. Yet, whomever the author is, they are not truly invested in a universal construct themselves. For if there had been such universality, there would have been a consideration of what Wheatley Peters' own mother had lost. As I write in the Age of Phillis, this is a complicated space. For I am grateful for Susanna Wheatley and the care and perhaps even love that she gave the African child she renamed. To put it baldly, I am not attempting to throw Susanna Wheatley under the bus. However, I would argue that the motivation of Odell is clear in memoir: to supplant the African parents of Wheatley Peters, especially the African mother, and substitute Susanna Wheatley as a saintly maternal figure, made all the more sympathetic because she is a white woman mothering a Black child. This lasting impression of Susanna Wheatley as a mother and not a slave mistress has endured in the writings by even Black historians and scholars, allowing her to occupy a blameless position as it relates to the enslavement of African Americans. Yet again, her role must be complicated, troubled, to use a traditional African American term, and it cannot be simplified. The most disturbing implication here is that somehow it's considered miraculous that a white woman could love a little Black girl fresh off the boat from Africa. That it would take a special kind of white woman to do that, which again refocuses the attention on Susanna Wheatley. She is lauded for setting aside any racial problematics to nurture this little girl, who then becomes extraordinary because of white female nurturing, not because of any affection or tutelage she has gained from the African parents from whom she was separated. This refocus resonates in a 20th and 21st century setting of transracial adoptive families, a dynamic by which children of color are expected to be grateful for care and feeding from their white adoptive parents. For example, in Birthmarks, Transracial Adoption in Contemporary America, scholar Barbara Patton discusses how Black birth parents are deemed pathological through what she calls cultural eugenics. Quote, transracial adoption provides the quality of salvation and redemption to this story. Not only does it representationally provide for the salvation of inner city Black children, but it allows for the redemption of whites from the burdens of racism and guilt by affirming as colorblind and anti-racist those politicians and advocates who favor transracial placements and whites who adopt Black children. Thus, this narrative enacts what Foucault, in his discussion of racisms of the state, calls the constant purification of society, unquote. Although Patton's argument concerning transracial adoption is contemporary, I believe it to be a useful framework, for her theme of white salvation is the story of the Odell memoir. This is not truly Wheatley Peters' narrative. It is the story of Susanna Wheatley. For after she dies, the narrative of the Black woman poet rapidly descends into tragedy and filth through the arrival of John Peters. This narrative amounts to a near complete deracination of the Black woman poet, again an attempt at what Foucault calls purification. And here I use the term deracination in its original sense. I'm sure I'm about to butcher this pronunciation. Informed by the French déraciner, which means to pull up from the roots. In this case, the origins of Wheatley Peters have been pulled up violently and shaken free of her natal soil, her culture, her pre-slavery education and intellectual capabilities, and her parents. As poet June Jordan writes in The Difficult Miracle of Black Poetry in America, something like a sonnet for Phyllis Wheatley, the African child's parents are bitterly anonymous. Because there has been such an embrace of the Odell memoir as biography, scholar John C. Shields calls Odell the principal biographer of Wheatley Peters. This text informs the treatment of her early childhood by later scholars and writers who usually focus on her life following her enslavement as a small child, beginning her biography with her 1761 arrival in Boston Harbor. There are some rare exceptions, beginning with the words of Wheatley Peters herself in her poem to the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest? What sorrows labor in my parents' breast? Stilled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father sees his babe beloved. Such my case. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway? And even when writing before her marriage to her best friend, Oba Tanner, the poet is aware that she's expected to be grateful for Susanna Wheatley saving her. For Wheatley Peters, or Wheatley at that time, overshadows her own trauma with gratitude toward the woman who owned at least one other slave. Quote, I was a poor little outcast and stranger when she took me in, not only her house, but I presently became a sharer in her most tender affections. I was treated by her more like her child than her servant. No opportunity was left unimproved of giving me the best of advice, but in terms how tender, how engaging. This I hope ever to keep in remembrance. After concluding my fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society, I'd been writing poems about African influences on Phyllis Wheatley Peters. I'd done some research on the African Atlantic, most notably Senegambia and the Atlantic slave trade by Boubacar Bari, Servants of Allah, African Muslims enslaved in the Americas by Sylviane Diouf, as well as the racially problematic but highly informative Travels into the Interior of Africa by Mungo Park, which describes Gambian villages in the 18th century. But it took a while for me to admit to myself that I was still writing about Phyllis Wheatley Peters' life in a decidedly narrow fashion. I wasn't thinking of her as an African child, not really. John and Susanna Wheatley, two slave owners, and their story dominated my manuscript in progress. The poems that I had written about the pre-slavery childhood of Wheatley Peters seemed perfunctory to me, quick gestures before moving into what I then believed was truly important, her arrival in Boston and all that transpired afterward. I wasn't satisfied with the manuscript. To use a Black church metaphor, there was no oil on the collection. Then around 2014, the words of Tanya Mears returned to me with greater significance. It had been 5 years before, back in that summer of 2009. You called the Wheatleys her surrogate parents. They weren't her parents. They were her masters. When I remembered these words, I understood that I've been quick to criticize other Wheatley Peters scholars, that I had been arrogant and hadn't seen the gaps in my own work. I had spent 15 years in the archives, not for her, but for me. Now it was time to make this her book. I can't really say when the realization hit me, when I saw that a kinship metaphor should be the guiding principle for the Age of Phillis, yet I do remember that I decided to rearrange and to bend my artistic argument that African origins were responsible for the genius of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. Yes, Susanna Wheatley nurtured this genius, but it was already present in that child that she renamed for a slave ship. This child had brought genius with her from across the water. I returned to the text that I had already read. In particular, I returned to Mungo Park's book, noting with excited interest his writing about Muslim women in the Gambia who wrote and read in Arabic. And I reread William Harris's essay, Phyllis Wheatley, A Muslim Connection. I began to move toward a deeper consideration of what kinship and lineage meant. For example, there had been only 1 or 2 poems about John Peters. I added more of these poems, and I connected them emotionally to the other poems that I've written about by the father of Wheatley Peters. I imagined that she had fallen in love with John Peters because he reminded her of the best parts of her father. He was brilliant, courageous, tender, and hardworking. And for several years, I've been working on an unrhymed sonnet crown about Black male participation in the American Revolution. I'd been utterly frustrated with that series. It seemed forced and borderline crude, and so I had set it aside for about 3 years. But once I located a kinship metaphor, I returned to that sonnet crown and again revised those poems with overt gestures toward African displacement and manhood. I did not want to excuse patriarchy, but I did want to lift up a loving model of vulnerable Black manhood. Though Wheatley Peters' father was lost to her, I wanted to show parallels between Bai and the Black soldiers courageously fighting in the revolution. The gestures toward maternity in the manuscript were the most emotionally powerful for me. Obviously, I located West Africa as a motherland, the place of Wheatley Peters' birth, and Yai as her mother. For this reason, Yai begins and ends the book, recalling another West African concept, this time not a Wolof idea, but the Asante notion of Sankofa, go back and fetch it. I wrote more poems about Ober Tanner, and I connected those poems to Yai as well, that Ober had Yai's face. And finally, 2 years before I finished the book, another huge revision. I decided to rewrite the book as a maternal epic, identifying African and Black American women as the 9 Muses. Yai and Wheatley Peters were 2 of these, and I wrote 7 other poems for a separate section. This gathering of Black and African women represents a loving ancestral and maternal circle, one which strengthens symbolic and actual kinship. This gathering represents home. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Honorée. That was magnificent. This is a wonderful journey you've taken us on. And I want to remind everyone who is participating tonight to post your questions in the Q&A. I will read these to Honorée, and please post questions so that we can continue this. And this first question is from Ellen Dunlap, who is our outgoing president. She will retire at the end of this month. Honorée, you have beautifully described your journey with Phyllis, but can you recall and share with us that first moment of introduction that drew you to her?
So as I talk about in the book, I was born in I don't know if I talked about this, but I was born in the late 60s, and I lived in Durham, North Carolina. And hi, Ellen, just to say hi, Ellen. And I lived in Durham, North Carolina, which even though the laws had changed, there was still de facto segregation. And so at my 99.9% African-American elementary school, we talked about who we call Phyllis Wheatley and other African-American firsts, right? So we learned about her in elementary school. And then my parents talked about her. They were both English professors. But it wasn't until 2003 when I read an essay in the New Yorker that was excerpted from Henry Louis Gates's book that was forthcoming. I think it's, and see, this is why I'm not an historian. I think it's Phillis Wheatley and the Founding Fathers or something like that. See, I'm so embarrassed and nervous. And it was fascinating. He was talking about Miss Phyllis's relationship with intellectual relationship with the Enlightenment philosophers, and how her intellectual and artistic production challenged racist ideologies of that time, that Black people were incapable of, profound thought. Immanuel Kant ordered the races with Africans down at the bottom, right up, and then, there was this connection that he sort of drew between the great apes and Africans. So it was just fascinating to me that this one woman had done so much work. And that was the first time that I really started reconsidering her legacy, right? Because, of all the sort of people that had gone before and hadn't really challenged the received narrative that we had about her, this was really exciting to me. And that was the moment, I think. And then I started sort of scribbling things, but I wasn't really writing poems until maybe about 4 years later. And that's when I started. And the first poem that I wrote is actually the first poem in the book.
I'm going to now turn to a question from Judith Gian Chapman. I am fascinated by Phyllis. Can you tell us some more about exactly what she wrote? What was the nature of her poems?
Well, we have her only published book. We do have some extant sort of loose, uncollected poems. And then some of those looser poems appeared in, and then I'll go back to the book that we do have, appeared in a book that she was trying to get published before she passed away, but she wasn't able to. And then her husband, Mr. John Peters, I'm Southern, so I call him Miss Phyllis and Mr. John. He was trying to get the book published too. But we have her 1773 volume, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. And so what we have is a collection of poems that really evidence she was, a later teenager, right? She wasn't really grown. Our frontal lobes don't really fully form until we're 24, 25. So she was like a late teenager, but she wrote about the Boston Massacre, of which we, of course, know that the Afro-Indigenous man, Crispus Attucks, was the first to fall in that. She wrote a lot of elegies about women who had lost their little babies. She wrote elegies about well-known, figures at the time. She wrote, about David and Goliath. So she wrote, she had a lot of discursive interest. She also was really about the classics. So you see a lot of classical references moving back and forth through her work. I hope that answers that question.
This is a question from Katie Childs. Professor Jeffers, thank you so much for the gift of your book and the tribute to Wheatley Peters. Would you please tell us what you think about when you read On Being Brought from Africa to America? And would you also like to talk about the differences between literature and history? I'm coming to think your book of poetry tell us more truths than Odell's biography. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay, I'm not playing with my phone. I'm actually looking up the essay Style as Protest, because this is going to tell us specifically, hold on, who's Style as Protest in the Poetry of Phyllis Wheatley by J.A. Lavernier in 1993. So one of the things is that is her most problematic poem for many people because of those lines. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land." And that's a poem that it was really hard for me to get around it, right? Then, this is what happens when you work on a book for 15 years and you're trying to trim down the bibliography, because poets do not like bibliographies. And so I was like trying to balance what my scholars were going to want with trying to get this book published as poetry. So I cut that essay, not on purpose, out of the bibliography, Style as Protest. But what Lavernier talks about is that when you look at the way she uses italics in that poem and quotes, I would say that when she says, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land," and that's italicized, I would look at that as what we would call a side eye. So we're looking, when we see in quotes, their color is a diabolic dye, and she has that in quotes. That's not, or this is what Lavernier argues, that's not what she believes. That's what she's heard. And so she's in the Bell Hooks, the theory of what Bell Hooks talks about, talking back. She's talking back to people who have diminished Black people, said they can't go to heaven, because at the end she says, "Remember Christians, Negroes, Black as Cain," right? And so can be refined and join the angelic train. It's interesting. I can remember a lot of her poetry, but I have a hard time remembering dates. I guess I truly am a poet. So in that way, what she's saying is, I'm going to heaven, right? I have been blessed by God. So I don't care what you say. You know, Jesus is my friend, Jesus, and he's going to take me to heaven. So I think that poem has a lot of layers to it. And I think that the half has not really been told of that, 8-line poem. But Cedric May also talks about, I believe it's Cedric May, and of course I've forgotten the title of this book, but I think it's Black Evangel. It's in my hold on. Please be in here. Yes, Evangelism and Resistance in the Black Atlantic, 1760 to 1835. I think it's him that talks about that is like an 8-line sermon or something like that. Or it may be Catherine Clay Bassard in Spiritual Interrogations. But one of those two talk about, both of them talk about testimony, right? So I don't know if that answers your question. I'd like to just give a short shout out to Wendy Roberts, who is in the Q&A. Congratulations on getting tenure, Wendy. Okay, let's keep on going.
Well, let me turn to a question by Bonnie O'Neill, who asks, "I so appreciate hearing about how you joined scholarship to art in the Age of Phillis. Given the many erasures and absences from the archive, can you talk a bit about how you think about poetry in relation to the archives, the work of fitting in those blanks imaginatively?"
That is a really beautiful and excellent question. And I'm somebody who really likes to spread the gospel of artists going back to the archives, right? I really, encourage a lot of poets and fiction writers to go back to the archives because I feel like the archives, well, first of all, I think it's just really it's really important for some of us who feel that that is our ministry to use poetry as a teaching tool, considering that so many of us don't know American history, right? To quote the great David McCullough, we don't teach civics anymore. Okay, so there are a lot of things, you know, and then I know with African Americans in particular, they constantly say, and Native American students will always say to me, they didn't teach me this in high school. So I feel like one of the things that poetry can do is when you base it upon what you find in the archives, right? You create what is historically possible, okay? And I tell my students this all the time: you don't have a cell phone ringing if you set your poem or your story in the 18th century, the 19th century, right? But you create what's historically possible, and then you leap into those gaps, right? And you attempt to tell what is emotionally possible. And here's the thing: situations change, rights change, laws change, but emotion doesn't change. People have always loved their children, right? People have always loved each other. People have always loved across racial lines. I chuckle a little bit when people think that it is some kind of extraordinary revolutionary act for somebody of one race, right? Because race doesn't really exist, to marry or mate or raise children with somebody else of another race. This has always happened, right? So, you know, is it courageous given a law? Yes. But the love itself is never revolutionary, right? It's just how you respond to what you feel. So I don't know if that answers that question, but.
And here's a question from Wendy Roberts. Honorée, you have been so important for helping recover Wheatley Peters. Thank you for that. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of the maternal epic and 9 Muses as a reinterpretation of Peters' Neoclassicism? This is so important, I think.
Well, you know, one of the things, Wendy, that is such a great question, and I'm going to flip through the book while I'm talking, but there is a quote that I have from Homer, and this book is so long. That's the only thing. I love this book, but but when you're trying to find stuff, but there is a quote from, here we go, from Homer's The Iliad, right? Translated by Alexander Pope, which the connection between Miss Phyllis and Alexander Pope's work has been talked about, you know, at great length. But I think that sometimes people don't know that she's alluding, right, to classics, to work. 9 years kept secret in the dark abode, secure I lay, concealed from man and God. Deep in the cavern rock my days were led, the rushing ocean murmured over my head. So that's from the Iliad. And then into the University of Cambridge in New England, Father of mercy, 'twas thy gracious hand brought me in safety from those dark abodes. I think that some people have thought that she meant Africa there, right? But she doesn't. She's talking, I think, about a slave ship. So I do think that you know, one of the things about her work, whether people, you know, we contemporary folks don't necessarily groove to it, right? The way that we do 21st century poetry, but the layers, you know, of the work. And I just finished writing an essay, a review essay about Lucille Clifton and her use of illusions, right? So I think that all of these illusions, these layers just continue to resonate. But in terms of the 9 muses, I'm always trying to talk back to the Western canon. Because I think that Black folks have their own canon and we have our own origins, and everything doesn't have to genuflect at the altar of Western literature. But I also think that there are some frameworks that are useful in Western literature. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to think about a Black woman's epic? And instead of using, you know, Greek mythology, Roman and Greek mythology, that I would use African mythology. And that's why when in that poem at the end with Belinda Sutton, when she's, you know, which is based upon her petition, and she starts calling the names of the Orisha, and I say Oshun, Obatala, right? So instead of her calling the names of Greek gods, she is calling the names of her own gods. And then there's that other poem, Yamaya, where it ends, you know, I am Yamaya, Black and remembering. So that's where that came from.
Here's a question from Jocelyn Moody. Professor Jeffers, I'm fascinated by print culture, so I'm curious about Phyllis Wheatley Peters' appreciation of other writers' texts. What writers do the manuscripts you examined show as among her favorite authors?
Oh, wow. Woo, there is always one person who asks this point, asks one of these kind of questions, right? Well, obviously Pope. Obviously sacred texts. I think that she was also very, I won't say these are favorite authors, but she was very politically engaged. And it's clear that she kept up with what was going on around her. And that's actually a heritage that contemporary Black writers have picked up. For example, you know, the Black arts movement, the Harlem Renaissance, where we are politically engaged. So I would say, I know that she was, you know, that she read the work of other authors, but to be honest, and I hope this doesn't sound, you know, lazy or dismissive, I was less concerned about, I'm going to say this delicately. I was less concerned, you know, everybody always talks about the white folks that she read and all the white people that she was friends with and how the white people this and that and the other. And I didn't care about that. That's been done. My work was to engage her with her culture and her people. And I didn't mention in this because I realized, like, I thought I was going short, but I actually was going long. So I cut a little bit. But I'm also very grateful for the fine work of Tara Bynum, who has done some really great work about Miss Phyllis's friendships with Black people in Newport, Rhode Island. So, you know, I think that work, I mean, Vincent Coretta has done such an extraordinary job of, you know, the details of print culture and how she connected, but I was more concerned with cultural excavation. And so there we have it.
This is our, I think will unfortunately be our last question because we're running out of time.
You can follow me for the after party on Twitter if you've got some more questions that you want to ask.
This comes from Nicole Aljo, who asks, thank you so much for sharing your powerful words with us. Do you have a favorite Wheatley Peters poem, or is there a poem of hers that you think is underappreciated?
Oh, yes. I quoted from it. Why am I doing this? It's not in here. I quoted from it to William, the Right Honorable. See, this is why I'm not an historian. The Right Honorable Earl of Dartmouth. And so when she talks about, it's a testimony, you know, a young in life by seeming cruel fate was snatched from Afrique's fancy happy seat. I love that poem. I think she's strong. I love the story behind it, that one of his friends did not believe that she had written those poems. So he showed up at the Wheatley's house and demanded that she write a poem, and she told him she was busy and he needed to come back the next day. Oh, I love that story, right? I love the backstory. I love how, you know, I love how courageous she is. You know, she was enslaved, and I don't think a lot of people really understand. I mean, as a Black woman myself, when people think I'm being bold, I'm only showing you 10% of any rage, any intellect sometimes, because, you know, when you get a Black woman who's sort of bold about her intellect, then, you know, we're getting above ourselves, we're uppity or whatever, right? So I know how scared I am, you know, moving through academia, moving through the world. I can only imagine what an enslaved young woman must have felt. So I love that poem. I think it's courageous, and she just put her whole self into that poem. And so that is my favorite poem by her.
Thank you, Honorée. Thank you for your courage and your boldness.
Thank you, Jim.
We need it now more than ever.
I'm doing my best.
And thank all of you for joining us tonight. We apologize that we couldn't continue and get all of your questions, but we appreciate your coming tonight, and we hope you'll join us again for another one of our programs. If you'd like to join our mailing list, there's links to that and to a evaluation form in the chat. Again, thank you so much, Honorée, for this wonderful presentation, and thank all of you for joining us.